BBC News Magazine, 14th of March, 2011. Frankenstein, 10 Possible Meanings. Meaning number 8. Difference should be celebrated, not shunned. Today's society has a greater understanding of the notion of difference, says Dr. Sage. So the scene where Frankenstein rejects his creation, so repulsed is he by his disfigurement, has a wider resonance. And here's a quote from Dr. Sage. Quote, everyone reading it now, everyone reading the book now, everyone knows that she's dramatizing difference in the most absolute way possible. Differences in race and class. That's why it's very important to think that the creature is a creature and not a monster, and that he has a voice. Well, this is a reading that I will wager has occurred to many of us as we've made our way through the book. What I would like to do is put some language in the book itself into evidence, as exhibits with respect to this larger question, this larger issue. And here's one of those pieces. This is, of course, Victor first vision of first actual confrontation, other than, of course, the night that the monster was born, so to speak. I'm going to kill this music. And he sees him in the environs of Mont Blanc, okay, as you see in the passage. But drop down a bit to the paragraph that confronts us here at the bottom. As I said this, he offers a little prayer. I suddenly beheld the figure of a man at some distance advancing towards me with superhuman speed. He bounded over the crevices in the ice among which I had walked with caution. His stature also as he approached seemed to exceed that of a man. I was troubled. A mist came over my eyes, and I felt a faintness seize me, but I was quickly restored by the cold gale of the mountains. Maybe that will not surprise us. I perceived as the shape came nearer, sight tremendous and abhorred, that it was the wretch whom I had created. I trembled with rage and horror, resolving to wait his approach and then close with him in mortal combat. He approached. His countenance bespoke bitter anguish combined with disdain and malignity, while its unearthly ugliness rendered it almost too horrible for human eyes. And as you can tell from the quote I pulled out there on the left, that last bit of language I find very important. And I find as well that it is to be taken seriously, especially when you look for a consistency of such responses, or in such responses over the course of the book, as I'm about to suggest to you. Yeah, here at the end, or towards the very end of the book, he paused, looking on me with wonder, and again turning towards the lifeless form of his creator. He seemed to forget my presence, and every feature and gesture seemed instigated by the wildest rage of some uncontrollable passion. This is, of course, a confrontation, the first and only, and it leads to a conversation between the monster and Walton, okay, as opposed to Victor. Go up one sentence, and I think you'll see something of some interest. Never did I behold a vision. This is his report upon the appearance of the monster. Never did I behold a vision so horrible as his face, of such loathsome yet appalling hideousness. And note the next. I shut my eyes involuntarily and endeavored to recollect what were my duties with regard to this destroyer. And he calls on him to stay. So he overcomes his horror. I think that's a pretty good example of it here. But I want you to look at that line. I shut my eyes involuntarily, because I think that's suggestive. And then here again. Now this is the monster himself, okay, who starts back, closes his eyes involuntarily, or as we saw in the first of the slides for this little lesson, right, found the visage of the monster. This is the monster himself finding his own visage too much, just too much, almost too much for human sight, Victor himself puts it. Almost too much for superhuman, monstrous sight as well. Let's take a look. About midway through the paragraph at the top that begins this reading, I usually perceive that although I eagerly long to discover myself to the cottagers, you see where we are in the plot, I ought not to make the attempt until I had first become master of their language, which knowledge might enable me to make them overlook the deformity of my figure, for which also the contrast perpetually presented to my eyes had made me acquainted. So you know where we are in the plot. This is, of course, Safi and Felix and the grandfather. I had admired the perfect forms of my cottagers, their grace, beauty, and delicate complexions. But how was I terrified when I viewed myself in a transparent pool? At first, I started back, unable to believe that it was indeed I who was reflected in the mirror. And when I became fully convinced, in other words, when I took the full measure of my own horror, when I became fully convinced that I was in reality the monster that I am, I was filled with the bitterest sensations of despondence and mortification. Alas, I did not yet entirely know the fatal effects of this miserable deformity. So the monster himself finds his appearance extremely difficult to take in, and to very difficult for him to accommodate himself to his own appearance. So you can imagine how others might feel, right? Okay, here we are at the climax of the Felix, Safi, and Agatha subplot, right? And this is the great reveal. This is when the monster reveals himself to the cottagers, more or less inadvertently, of course, the old man he has spoken with, who cannot see him. So, you know, this is Felix, of course, Safi, and Agatha can see him. And this is their response to seeing him. Who can describe their horror and consternation on beholding me? Agatha fainted, and Safi, unable to attend to her friend, rushed out of the cottage. Felix darted forward and with supernatural force tore me from his father, to whose knees I clung. And you remember the rest. I think what's really important about this passage is that we have the people on the scene here, Felix, Safi, and Agatha. And I think most especially Felix and Agatha. Safi as well, she has been the victim, might not have quite the intellectual chops that Felix obviously has, but Safi has herself been the victim of oppressive notions of normalcy and of unfair and stereotypical visions of abnormality and otherness and all the rest. Going back to number 8 from the BBC news magazine, difference should be celebrated, not shunned. Here, difference is being, I think you would agree, shunned, not celebrated. And it's being shunned and not celebrated by the three people, certainly two of the three people, who, are most likely by their past experience and by their personal histories and by their temperaments to celebrate difference. And I think that's very, very suggestive and very important, a very important detail going on in the book. And we'll talk a little bit about this tomorrow on Wednesday. I'll see you then.